At 2:01 in the morning on January 3, 2026, the president of a sovereign country was taken out of his own military base by soldiers from a different country. No negotiation, no extradition hearing, no handover ceremony. Delta Force operators moved through Fort Tiuna in Caracas, put Nicolas Maduro and his wife into custody, and flew them to New York. 4 days later, the United States Secretary of Energy went in front of cameras and said out loud that America would be handling the sale of Venezuelan oil and the revenue from it indefinitely. Indefinitely. They took the president, then they took the oil. By January 5th, Venezuela had a new acting president. By the end of the month, the law that guaranteed the Venezuelan state majority control of its own oil had been rewritten. By March, the American embassy in Caracas, shut since 2019, was opening its doors again. And Maduro was sitting in a federal detention center in Brooklyn, being processed like any other defendant in a narcotics case. Here's the part that should stop you cold. This is not a poor country. This is not a country that ran out of resources. Venezuela sits on roughly 300 billion barrels of proven crude, the largest confirmed oil reserve on planet Earth, larger than Saudi Arabia's, larger than Iran's, larger than Iraq's. In 1970, this country pumped 3.75 million barrels a day. Venezuelans flew to Miami to shop and got a nickname for it, Dam Dos, give me two. 50 years later, close to 8 million of its people had walked out. Not flown, walked. Across borders, through jungle, carrying children. So how does the country with the most oil in the world end up with the worst peacetime economic collapse ever recorded? How do you starve on top of a fortune? The answer is not one villain. It's a machine, and the machine started running almost 100 years ago, and almost nobody noticed it running until it had eaten everything. By the end of this video, you'll understand something uncomfortable. What happened to Venezuela is not exotic. There is an economic name for it. It has happened in smaller doses to a dozen other countries, and Venezuela is simply the version where nobody hit the brakes. Let's go back to a farm in 1922. December 14th, 1922. A drilling crew is working near Lake Maracaibo in the northwest of the country. The well is called Barroso No. 2. At around 4 in the morning, it blows. The gusher throws crude 130 feet into the air and does not stop for 9 days. Local farmers wake up to find their fields black. Before Barroso, Venezuela was a coffee and cocoa country, rural, poor, run by a dictator named Juan Vicente Gomez, who handed out oil concessions to his friends and to Royal Dutch Shell. After Barroso, the world's oil companies arrived like it was a gold rush, because it was one. 6 years later, in 1928, Venezuela was the largest oil exporter on Earth, second largest producer behind only the United States. And this is the exact moment the trap opens, not the moment it closes. The moment it opens, quietly, with everybody celebrating. Money starts flooding in. Foreign buyers need Venezuelan currency to buy Venezuelan oil, so demand for the bolivar rises, so the bolivar gets strong. A strong currency sounds like good news. It is not good news for anyone in that country trying to make and sell something that isn't oil. Because a strong bolivar means imported shoes are cheaper than Venezuelan shoes. Imported rice is cheaper than Venezuelan rice. Imported everything is cheaper than Venezuelan anything. Meanwhile, the oil sector pays wages nobody else can match, so your best engineers, your best mechanics, your best welders leave the factory and go work the fields. Economists have a name for this. They call it Dutch disease. The name comes from the Netherlands. In 1959, the Dutch found an enormous natural gas field at Groningen. Gas exports boomed, the guilder strengthened, and Dutch manufacturing quietly withered. In 1977, The Economist wrote it up, gave the phenomenon its name, and it stuck. But the Dutch caught it and survived it because they had a real industrial base, institutions with teeth, and a political system that could argue about it in public. Venezuela caught it in 1922 with none of those things. Through the 40s, 50s, and 60s, the oil money is simply too good for anyone to worry. In 1943, the government forces a 50-50 profit split with the foreign companies, which at the time was radical. Venezuela invents the idea. Saudi Arabia copies it 3 years later. In 1960, Venezuela's oil minister, Juan Pablo Perez Alfonso, sits down with the Saudis and helps found OPEC. Venezuela is not the follower here. Venezuela is the architect. By the early 70s, Venezuela is the richest country in Latin America. Skyscrapers, highways, universities. Democracy arrives in 1958 and actually holds, which in that region and that decade is remarkable. Immigrants pour in from Italy, Spain, and Portugal looking for work. Venezuela is the destination country. Let that sit for a second, because it inverts completely later. Then comes the biggest windfall in the country's history. October 1973. The Arab members of OPEC impose an oil embargo over Western support for Israel in the Yom Kippur War. Crude prices roughly quadruple in a matter of months. Venezuela is not an Arab country and is not part of the embargo. Venezuela just sells oil at the new price. Government revenue explodes. President Carlos Andrés Pérez takes office in 1974 with more money than any Venezuelan leader has ever had. And he does what almost anyone would do. He spends it. He calls it La Gran Venezuela. Steel plants, aluminum plants, hydroelectric projects, subsidies, and a public sector hiring spree that never really stops. And on January 1st, 1976, he nationalizes the oil industry. Shell, Exxon, Gulf, all bought out and folded into a new state company, Petróleos de Venezuela, PDVSA. And I want to be fair here because this gets misrepresented constantly. PDVSA in its first 2 decades was well run, technocratic. It trained world-class petroleum engineers and bought refineries in the United States and Europe. For a while, it was one of the best-regarded state oil companies anywhere. The problem was never PDVSA's competence. The problem was that the entire country was now a single company with a flag. Roughly 9 out of every $10 Venezuela earned abroad came from crude. Manufacturing had been hollowed out for 50 years. Agriculture had shrunk to almost nothing. The state was the biggest employer, the biggest investor, and the biggest customer, and every bolivar of that came out of one hole in the ground, which meant the entire national project rested on a single assumption, that the price of oil would stay high. And in 1985, a man in Riyadh decided it wouldn't. Most people telling this story skip straight to Chávez. If you skip this part, Chávez makes no sense at all. Through the early 80s, Saudi Arabia had been acting as OPEC's swing producer. Prices sagging? The Saudis cut their own output to prop the price back up. They did it over and over, and by 1985, their production had fallen from around 10 million barrels a day to about 2.5. They were carrying the entire cartel on their back, while everyone else quietly cheated on quotas. In late 1985, they stopped. They switched to what's called netback pricing and opened the taps. Oil went from around $27 a barrel to under $10 by the middle of 1986. More than a 60% cut in a matter of months. For Venezuela, that was the end of the world arriving on a Tuesday. Except the cracks had already shown 2 years earlier. February 18, 1983. Venezuelans still call it Viernes Negro, Black Friday. The government could no longer defend the bolivar's fixed rate against the dollar, and devalued. A currency that had been one of the most stable in the hemisphere broke in a single day. The country had borrowed heavily against future oil revenue during the good years. That's the other half of Dutch disease nobody warns you about. High resource prices don't just distort your economy, they distort your credit rating, and lenders will hand you enormous sums on the assumption the boom is permanent. The boom was not permanent. The debt was. So by the late 80s, Venezuela is in a vice. Debt in dollars, revenue collapsing, inflation climbing, and a middle class that grew up thinking Miami weekends were normal, watching its savings evaporate. In 1988, Carlos Andrés Pérez gets elected again, the same man who presided over the boom. People vote for him because they remember the good years and think he can bring them back. He can't. Within weeks of taking office in 1989, he announces an IMF-backed adjustment package. Fuel subsidies cut, prices deregulated, bus fares up. On February 27, 1989, it detonates. It starts with commuters in Guarenas, outside Caracas, refusing to pay the new bus fares. Within hours, it's a riot. Within a day, the capital is being looted street by street, and the army is deployed against its own population. They call it the Caracazo. The official death toll is around 277. Human rights investigators and forensic work at mass graves put the real number in the thousands. That is the day the Venezuelan political system lost its people. Not in 1998 when Chávez won. In 1989, when soldiers fired on Caracas over the price of a bus ticket. 3 years later, on February 4, 1992, a paratrooper lieutenant colonel named Hugo Chávez led a coup attempt against Perez. It failed completely. His units were surrounded, his allies didn't move in time, and by morning, it was over. Then the government made the greatest political miscalculation in modern Venezuelan history. They put him on television to tell his own men to surrender. Chávez stood there in his uniform and his red beret, took full responsibility on camera, which no Venezuelan politician had done in living memory, and said the objectives had not been achieved por ahora, for now. 2 words. He went into prison a failed coup leader and came out a national figure. Perez was impeached for corruption the next year. Chávez was pardoned in 1994. And in December 1998, running as an outsider against a political class everybody now despised, he won the presidency with 56% of the vote. Hold on to this going into the next chapter. Chávez did not create Venezuela's dependency on oil. He inherited it, fully formed, 76 years old and load-bearing. What he did was bet the entire country on it one more time. At the exact moment the biggest oil boom in history was about to begin. For the first couple of years, Chávez is working with cheap oil. Crude was near $10 a barrel in 1998. Money is tight. Then 2 things happen at once. The first is political. In April 2002, a coup removes Chávez from power for roughly 47 hours. Street protests and loyalist units put him back. He returns radicalized, and now he knows exactly who his enemies are. In December 2002, PDVSA's own management and much of the opposition launch a general strike to force him out. They shut the oil industry down. Production falls off a cliff. The strike drags into February 2003, and it fails, and Chávez fires them. Around 18,000 PDVSA employees, close to half the workforce, including a huge share of its senior engineers, geologists, and technical staff. Decades of accumulated expertise gone in a single administrative act. That is the moment PDVSA stops being an oil company and becomes an arm of the government. From then on, it isn't just pumping crude, it's running food distribution, building housing, funding social programs directly out of its own accounts. The second thing is that the price of oil starts going up, and up, and up. China is industrializing at a pace nobody modeled correctly. Demand outruns supply. Crude climbs through the 2000s and peaks in July 2008 at around $147 a barrel. Venezuela is now swimming in more money than it had in 1973, and this time it lasts the better part of a decade. And the results are real. I want to be honest about that because the caricature version of this story pretends nothing good ever happened. Poverty fell sharply, millions of people got primary health care for the first time through the Barrio Adentro program, largely staffed by Cuban doctors paid for in crude. Literacy programs reached people the old system had ignored for a century. Chávez was re-elected repeatedly, and he was not stealing those elections. He was popular, and the people who loved him had reasons. In 2007, he goes further. He forces the foreign majors in the Orinoco Belt to convert into joint ventures, with PDVSA holding the majority stake. ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips refuse the terms and walk. Exxon's claim on its lost assets runs past $16 billion. The crowd loved it. Sovereignty over our own oil. But look at what's happening underneath the applause. Money that should have gone into wells, pipelines, refineries, and drilling was being routed straight into consumption. Oil wells are not a savings account. They decline. Pressure drops, equipment corrodes, and heavy Venezuelan crude in particular needs constant investment and constant diluent just to keep moving through a pipe. The expertise to manage that had been fired in 2003. The capital to fund it was being spent on this year's popularity. Meanwhile, Dutch disease is in its terminal stage. With the currency artificially strong and oil dollars everywhere, it was cheaper to import practically anything than to make it. So, Venezuela imported it. Food, machinery, medicine, car parts, toilet paper. A country with some of the most fertile land in South America was importing most of what it ate. And a currency control system introduced in 2003 let the government decide who got dollars at the official rate. With the right political connections, you could buy dollars at the official price, sell them at the black market price, and make a fortune without producing a single thing. Estimates of what disappeared through that mechanism run into the tens of billions. By 2012, Venezuela's non-oil economy was a shell wearing an oil company's clothes. And then, in March 2013, Hugo Chávez died of cancer at 58. He named his vice president a successor. A former bus driver and union organizer named Nicolas Maduro won the election that April by less than 2 percentage points. Maduro inherited a country that was still, at that moment, functioning. Oil was above $100. He had about 18 months before the floor gave way. In the second half of 2014, oil prices crashed again. American shale had flooded the market, OPEC declined to cut, and crude fell from over $100 to under $50 in about 6 months. Every structural weakness Venezuela had spent 90 years building was exposed at once. The government's response was to deny any of it was happening. They kept the price controls, so producing food at the legal price meant losing money, so producers stopped producing. They kept the currency controls, so importers couldn't get dollars, so imports collapsed too. And to cover a budget with no revenue, the central bank printed money. What follows is one of the worst hyperinflations in recorded human history. Estimates for 2018 alone range from around 65,000% by the IMF's calculation to roughly 80,000% by Steve Hanke's measurement to nearly 1.7 million% according to Venezuela's own opposition-led National Assembly. Take whichever number you like, they all describe the same thing. They describe cashiers who stopped counting banknotes and started weighing them on scales because counting took too long and the paper was worth less than its weight. They describe people folding Bolivar notes into handbags and ornaments because that was worth more than spending them. They describe a currency redenominated 3 separate times, in 2008, 2018, and 2021, knocking a combined 14 zeros off the face value. The physical economy went with it. In 2016, a national survey found the average Venezuelan had lost around 8 kilograms of body weight in a year. People called it La Dieta de Maduro, the Maduro diet. Hospitals ran out of antibiotics and gauze. Measles came back. Diphtheria came back. Malaria exploded, partly because desperate people were digging for gold in the Orinoco mining arc, in flooded pits that are perfect mosquito habitat. In March 2019, the national grid failed. Most of the country lost power for days. In hospitals, people died when the ventilators stopped. And the oil, the one thing holding all of it up, was dying too. From 3.75 million barrels a day at the 1970 peak to about 3.5 million in 1998, to roughly 1 million by the end of 2018. Then in July 2020, Venezuelan production bottomed out at 392,000 barrels a day. 392,000, in the country with the largest reserves on Earth. The sanctions accelerated it. In January 2019, the United States sanctioned PDVSA directly, cutting Venezuela off from its largest customer and from the American light crude it had been buying to thin its own heavy oil. I want to be precise here, because this is where the political argument lives. The collapse of Venezuelan oil production began years before the 2019 sanctions. Production was already in freefall by 2016. What the sanctions did was remove any possibility of recovery and deepen the humanitarian damage. Both things are true at once, and anyone selling you only one of them is selling you something. Meanwhile, the state went looking elsewhere for revenue. Gold out of the illegal mining arc moved through Turkey and the Emirates. Crude sold at steep discounts through opaque intermediaries. And drugs. In November 2025, the United States formally designated the Cartel de los Soles, the Cartel of the Suns, named for the sun insignia on Venezuelan generals' epaulets, as a foreign terrorist organization. American prosecutors alleged the network reached the very top of the government. And the people left. Close to 7.9 million Venezuelans, roughly a quarter of the population, spread across Colombia, Peru, Brazil, Chile, Ecuador, the United States, and Spain. Many crossed the Darien Gap on foot, one of the most dangerous migration routes on the planet, carrying children. The country that took in Italian and Portuguese immigrants in the 1950s had become the largest displacement crisis in the Western Hemisphere. Politically, Maduro simply stopped losing. The opposition won the National Assembly in 2015, and the Supreme Court stripped it of its powers. On July 28, 2024, Venezuela held a presidential election. Opposition leader Maria Corina Machado had been barred from running and backed Edmundo Gonzalez in her place. Her volunteers collected copies of tally sheets from polling stations across the country and published them, and those sheets showed Gonzalez winning by a wide margin. The Electoral Authority declared Maduro the winner and never published the underlying results. In October 2025, Machado was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, and through that autumn, something else was moving: American warships assembling in the Caribbean. The strike group built around the USS Gerald R. Ford arriving in November. American forces striking boats they said were trafficking narcotics. Inside Venezuela, most people assumed it was pressure, theater, a negotiating posture. It was not a negotiating posture. Operation Absolute Resolve began in the small hours of January 3, 2026. American strikes hit targets around Caracas, while a Delta Force element moved on Fort Tiuna, the military complex where Maduro was located. The operation ran on CIA intelligence. Maduro and his wife were taken alive, moved to the USS Iwo Jima, and flown to New York. By January 4th, he was in a federal courthouse in Manhattan, handcuffed and limping, pleading not guilty to narco-terrorism and drug conspiracy charges American prosecutors had first filed against him back in 2020. That night cost somewhere between 23 and 47 Venezuelan military personnel killed, 32 Cuban military and intelligence personnel killed, 2 civilians killed, and 7 American soldiers injured. And then, the part almost nobody predicted. The Venezuelan government did not fight. On January 5th, Vice President Delcy Rodriguez was sworn in as acting president under Article 233 of the Constitution, the clause covering a vacancy in the presidency. She was sworn in by her own brother, Jorge Rodriguez, president of the National Assembly. She publicly called Maduro's capture a kidnapping, and then she started dismantling his state. January 8th, 9 political prisoners released, and Washington reportedly calls off a second wave of strikes. January 20th, the first $300 million from American-facilitated crude sales arrives. January 28th, funds frozen under the 2019 sanctions are released. January 30th, an amnesty law covering political offenses going back to 1999. And on January 29th, the big one, Rodriguez signs a hydrocarbon reform that ends PDVSA's guaranteed majority stake in joint ventures. Foreign and private companies can now operate Venezuelan fields directly and keep more of what they pump. What Chávez took in 2007, given back in a single signature. Then the machinery of normalization. Diplomatic relations restored March 5th. Washington formally recognizes Rodriguez's authority March 12th. The embassy in Caracas reopens March 30th. commercial flights resume April 30th, and running underneath all of it, the sentence that ends up in the history books. On January 7th, 2026, United States Energy Secretary Chris Wright stated that the United States would control the sale of Venezuelan oil and the revenue from it indefinitely. Not temporarily, not until a transition, indefinitely. By February, Wright was reporting more than $1 billion in Venezuelan crude sold this way. By mid-year, of roughly $8 billion in 2026 oil sales, about $5.5 billion had actually reached Venezuela. The rest sits in American-controlled accounts through a process one analysis described as entirely opaque. The oil industry Venezuela nationalized on January 1, 1976, exactly 50 years and 2 days before the raid, was now being sold by Washington. Production did rise. By June 2026, Venezuela was pumping just over 1 million barrels a day, up more than 17% year-on-year. ExxonMobil, which in January had called the country uninvestable, was circling again by August. Chevron was planning to raise its own output by half by 2028. But read the fine print. Analysts put the cost of repairing the corroded infrastructure at around $100 billion. Lake Maracaibo alone needs $2.5 billion in environmental cleanup, after years of leaks turned parts of the lake's surface into a slick visible from orbit. Rebuilding this industry is a project measured in decades, and Venezuela was about to lose another 6 months to something nobody planned for at all. At 18:04 local time on June 24, 2026, a magnitude 7.2 earthquake struck Veroes municipality in Yaracuy state, in the northwest of the country, along the San Sebastian fault system. 39 seconds later, a magnitude 7.5 hit the same area. It was the strongest earthquake in Venezuela since 1900. The heaviest destruction ran through the coastal region of La Guaira and into Caracas itself. Nearly 800 buildings collapsed outright. Around 59,000 more were damaged. And this is where 90 years of neglect turned a natural disaster into something worse, because a great deal of what came down was housing built badly, built informally, or built in boom years and maintained in bust years. The death toll climbed for weeks, then months. By August 3, 2026, the President of the National Assembly announced 6,125 confirmed dead, 61,000 people treated in hospitals. The World Bank put physical losses at around $20 billion, and as of that same announcement, only 16.5% of the rubble had been cleared. A country whose health system had already collapsed, whose grid was already failing, whose engineers had already emigrated, was now running a rescue and reconstruction operation that would strain a wealthy nation. Residents in the worst-hit areas said military and government help simply did not arrive during the window when it mattered. That is where the country sits as of August 2026. An acting president, nobody elected to the office, a deposed president awaiting trial in Brooklyn, an oil industry whose revenues route through Washington, 6,000 dead from a fault line, roughly a quarter of the population still living somewhere else. The political future is genuinely unresolved. In June, moderate opposition figures opened negotiations with the National Assembly over a path to elections, with American backing. Maria Corina Machado, the Nobel laureate, found her own coalition pushed to the margins of that process, issued a manifesto from Panama demanding a leading role, and has said she will return from exile and run for president before the end of the year. Nobody has published a date for an election that anyone trusts. So let's go back to the question at the start. How does a country with the largest oil reserves on Earth end up here? The instinct is to look for a villain, and you can pick one. Maduro if you want the easy answer, Chávez if you want the ideological answer, Washington if you want the geopolitical answer. American sanctions did deepen the suffering. Chávez did gut the technical core of PDVSA. Maduro did print a currency into oblivion and hold an election he lost. All of that is true, and none of it is the actual mechanism. The actual mechanism started in 1922, when oil made everything else in Venezuela not worth doing. That's what a resource curse is. It isn't a spell, It's an incentive structure. When one commodity generates the overwhelming majority of your national income, three things follow almost automatically. Your currency strengthens and kills off every other industry you have. Your government stops needing to tax its citizens, and a government that doesn't need your taxes doesn't need your consent. And the fastest way to get rich in your country stops being building something and starts being standing close to whoever controls the flow. Every Venezuelan government from 1922 onward, dictatorship and democracy, right and left, faced the same choice. Use the boom to build an economy that could survive without the boom, or spend it. Every single one of them chose to spend it. Because spending it wins the next election, and building takes 20 years and thanks nobody. Norway found oil in the North Sea in 1969 and set up a sovereign wealth fund that today holds well over $1 trillion, precisely because Norwegian politicians decided the money was not theirs to spend. That fund is the proof this outcome was never inevitable. It was a decision made over and over for a century by people who each had a very reasonable-sounding argument for why this year was not the year to start saving. Resources are not wealth. Resources are a test. The test is not geological, it's institutional, and Venezuela failed it about 11 times in a row. So here's the question I'll leave you with, and I mean it seriously, because I don't think it has a clean answer. Where was the last exit? Was it 1976, when they nationalized the oil and never diversified around it? Was it 1989, when they tried the painful reform, the country burned for a week, and no politician ever dared try again? Was it 2003, when 18,000 engineers were fired for the wrong political opinions? Or was there never an exit at all, because a country where 9 out of $10 come out of one hole in the ground was always going to end up belonging to whoever wanted that hole badly enough? Tell me in the comments where you think the point of no return actually was. On a story like this one, I'd rather hear the disagreement than the agreement. If this walked you through something you'd only ever seen in headlines, subscribe, because that's the entire job of this channel. And hit like, because that's the only thing that tells the algorithm a half-hour video about oil economics was worth somebody's evening. There's another country sitting on an enormous fortune right now, making a lot of the same choices. That video is already on screen. Go watch it.